Have you ever walked away from a conversation only to keep having it in your head for the rest of the day? Maybe someone said something that sounded harmless. Everyone else seemed to move on, but somehow those few words stayed with you. You replayed them while driving home, while making dinner, while trying to fall asleep, not because you wanted to, but because your mind simply wouldn't let them go. Or maybe you've ever apologized before you were even sure you had done something wrong. Not because someone asked you to, because it felt easier than risking conflict. Maybe you've smiled through an entire afternoon while quietly wondering why you felt so heavy inside. Then someone asked, "Are you okay?" And without thinking, you answered, "Yeah, I'm fine." Because explaining what was happening inside felt almost impossible. If any of that feels familiar, I don't think you're unusual. I think you're human. Yet so many of us reach the same conclusion. I'm too sensitive. I care too much. Why can't I just let things go? Those thoughts can become so familiar that we stop questioning them. We simply accept them as part of who we are. We begin describing ourselves with words like emotional, dramatic, or too much. Eventually, we stop seeing those words as opinions. We start believing they're facts. But what if they aren't? What if you've been judging yourself through the lens of a misunderstanding? What if the problem has never been that you feel too deeply, but that you've spent years carrying feelings without ever learning what to do with them? Most of us assume emotions disappear if we ignore them long enough. We stay busy. We tell ourselves tomorrow will feel different. We distract ourselves with work, responsibilities, entertainment, or endless scrolling. Sometimes it even seems to work. Until one ordinary Tuesday, and suddenly everything you've been pushing down comes spilling out at once. In today's video, we're going to break down why your brain holds on to these heavy feelings, and more importantly, how you can finally stop carrying them so you can make peace with how deeply you feel. There is something surprisingly gentle that happens when you stop asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" and begin asking, "Why might this feeling be here?" It is a small shift, just a few words, but sometimes a small shift is enough to change the entire direction of your life. Many of us have spent years treating emotions like unwanted guests. We welcome happiness, we tolerate excitement, but when anxiety knocks on the door, we pretend we're not home. When sadness arrives, we try to distract ourselves. When anger appears, we often judge ourselves before we even understand what happened. Somewhere along the way, we learned to divide our emotional world into two categories: good feelings and bad feelings. If we feel grateful, we're doing well. If we feel peaceful, we're healing. But if we feel afraid, ashamed, jealous, or overwhelmed, we quietly wonder what's wrong with us. The problem is that emotions were never meant to be graded that way. An emotion is not a reward for living well, nor is it a punishment for getting life wrong. An emotion is information. It is your mind and body trying to tell you something about your experience. That doesn't mean every emotion tells the complete truth. It doesn't mean every feeling should become an action, but every feeling deserves to be understood before it is dismissed. Imagine driving a car and seeing the fuel warning light appear on the dashboard. You probably wouldn't become angry at the light itself. You wouldn't cover it with tape and hope the problem disappeared. The light isn't creating the problem. It's simply telling you that something needs your attention. Your emotions work in much the same way. Fear may be reminding you that something feels uncertain. Disappointment may reveal that something mattered more than you realized. Loneliness may quietly point toward a need for deeper connection. Even frustration can become valuable information. Sometimes it tells you that you've been carrying too much for too long. Sometimes it tells you that one of your boundaries has been crossed so many times that your heart no longer knows how to whisper. It only knows how to shout. In the conversation that inspired this video, Dr. Marc Brackett encourages us to see emotions as data rather than enemies. Instead of immediately pushing feelings away, we can become curious about what they might be communicating. I think curiosity is one of the kindest gifts we can offer ourselves, because curiosity doesn't accuse, it doesn't rush to conclusions, it simply says, "Tell me more." That question alone can interrupt years of self-judgment. Imagine waking up feeling anxious before an important meeting. Your first instinct might be to criticize yourself. Why can't I just relax? Other people don't seem this nervous. I'm doing it again. But what if anxiety isn't trying to ruin your day? What if it is reminding you that this meeting matters because your work matters? Or because you care about making a good impression? Or because you're stepping into something new and your brain is trying to protect you from uncertainty? The feeling itself hasn't changed, but your relationship with it has. Or think about the last time someone disappointed you. Perhaps you told yourself you shouldn't feel hurt. Maybe you said, "I'm overreacting. It's not that big of a deal." Yet the feeling remained. Not because you were weak, but because disappointment often points toward something we valued, a promise, a friendship, a hope we quietly carried. Ignoring that feeling doesn't make it disappear. It simply leaves the message unread. This doesn't mean every emotional signal is perfectly accurate. Sometimes fear exaggerates danger. Sometimes shame tells stories that were never true. Sometimes anger blames the wrong person. Emotions offer information, but they still need wisdom, reflection, and context. That is why understanding them matters so much. When we skip that step, we often react automatically. When we slow down long enough to listen, we gain something incredibly valuable: choice. Instead of being pulled wherever our emotions lead us, we begin walking beside them. We notice them, we learn from them, and then we decide what kind of response truly reflects the person we want to become. I've come to believe that emotional maturity isn't about feeling less, it's about listening more carefully. Not every feeling needs to be followed, but every feeling deserves a moment of honest attention. Perhaps that sounds simple. In many ways it is, but simple doesn't always mean easy. Especially if you've spent years believing that strength meant staying busy enough to outrun your emotions, or believing that kindness meant taking care of everyone except yourself. Or believing that asking what you feel is somehow selfish. It isn't. Because when you learn to understand your own emotional world, you become more patient with the emotional worlds of others as well. Compassion almost always begins with understanding, and understanding begins with paying attention. The next time an uncomfortable feeling shows up, you don't have to welcome it with open arms. You don't even have to like it. Just resist the urge to push it away immediately. Instead, pause for a moment and ask yourself one quiet question. If this feeling is trying to tell me something, what might I be missing? You may not have the answer right away. That's okay. Learning to listen takes practice. But there is another step that makes listening much easier. Because it's difficult to understand a feeling when you don't yet have the words to describe it. And that is where we'll go next. Have you ever noticed how quickly we answer the question, "How are you?" Most of the time, the answer comes almost automatically. "I'm fine, just tired, a little stressed." We say the words so often that we hardly stop to ask whether they're actually true. Sometimes they are, but more often than we'd like to admit, they're simply placeholders, a way of describing something we haven't really taken the time to understand. Imagine walking into a doctor's office and saying, "Something hurts." The doctor wouldn't hand you a prescription right away. The first question would almost certainly be, "Where does it hurt?" Because that single answer changes everything. A headache is different from chest pain. A sore muscle is different from a broken bone. Without clarity, even the best treatment becomes guesswork. Our emotional lives work the same way. When we tell ourselves, "I'm upset," we haven't actually said very much. Upset because you feel rejected? Upset because you're disappointed? Upset because you're embarrassed? Upset because you're grieving something you haven't admitted you've lost? Those feelings may look similar from the outside. Inside, they are completely different experiences, and each one asks for something different. This is why Dr. Marc Brackett places so much importance on learning to label emotions accurately. Naming a feeling isn't about finding the perfect word. It's about moving from a vague sense of distress toward a clearer understanding of what you're actually experiencing. Think about the last time someone asked, "What's wrong?" Maybe your first instinct was to say, "I don't know." I don't think that answer means you were disconnected from your emotions. I think it often means no one ever taught you the language to describe them. We aren't born with emotional vocabulary, we learn it. Just like we learn every other language. When children first begin seeing colors, everything is simply color. But then someone points to the sky and says, "That's blue." They point to the leaves and say, "That's green." Suddenly, the world hasn't changed, but the child has. They begin noticing differences that were always there. Not because new colors appeared, but because they finally had words for them. Our emotional world becomes richer in exactly the same way. The more precisely we can name what we're feeling, the more clearly we begin to understand ourselves. And something remarkable happens when understanding replaces confusion. Self-judgment begins to soften. Imagine coming home after a difficult day. You tell yourself, "I'm angry." But after sitting quietly for a few minutes, another truth begins to surface. Maybe you aren't angry at all. Maybe you're hurt. Maybe you spent weeks giving your best to something that mattered deeply to you, only to feel unnoticed. Anger may have been the loudest voice, but disappointment was the quieter truth underneath it. Or perhaps you keep telling yourself you're anxious, yet when you slow down, you realize you're not afraid of failing. You're afraid of disappointing someone you love. Again, the feeling changes the moment you understand it more clearly. The situation outside hasn't changed, but your relationship with it has. I've often wondered how many of us spend years trying to solve the wrong problem. We try to fix anger when the real wound is loneliness. We try to overcome procrastination when our deeper struggle is fear. We tell ourselves we're unmotivated when we're actually exhausted. Without the right words, we end up fighting shadows. No wonder we feel stuck. The goal isn't to become an expert who can identify every emotion perfectly. No one can. The goal is simply to become a little more honest with ourselves, to replace "I'm fine" with "I'm disappointed," or "I'm overwhelmed," or even "I'm not sure what I'm feeling yet, but I'd like to understand." That last sentence may be one of the most compassionate things you ever say to yourself, because it replaces certainty with curiosity, and curiosity creates space. Not the kind of space that pushes emotions away, but the kind that allows them to be understood. I've come to believe that naming our emotions doesn't make us more emotional. It makes us less alone. Because the moment we can finally describe what's happening inside us, we're no longer wandering through our inner world in the dark. We have a map, maybe not a complete one, but enough to take the next step. And once you begin seeing your emotions with greater clarity, another question naturally appears. Knowing what you feel is important, but what do you do with that understanding? How do you keep an emotion from becoming the thing that decides your next action? That's what we'll explore next. There is a moment that exists in every difficult situation. It's so brief that we usually don't notice it. It comes after the emotion arrives, but before we respond. For many of us, that moment feels invisible. Someone says something hurtful, and the words are already out of our mouths before we've even realized we're upset. An email arrives, and within seconds we've imagined the worst. A loved one forgets something important, and suddenly we're arguing about much more than what happened today. It can feel as though emotions simply take over, as if they grab the steering wheel while we're left sitting in the passenger seat. But emotional intelligence isn't about pretending that first reaction doesn't exist. It isn't about becoming someone who never feels frustrated, disappointed, or afraid. It's about discovering that there is a little more space between a feeling and a response than we once believed. And inside that small space lives something incredibly powerful: choice. That choice is often much smaller than people imagine. It isn't always a life-changing decision. Sometimes it's simply deciding not to answer immediately. Sometimes it's taking one slow breath before speaking. Sometimes it's excusing yourself for 5 minutes because you know that the version of you standing here isn't the version you want to bring into this conversation. We often think emotional regulation means controlling our feelings, but that's not really what it means. In the conversation that inspired this video, Dr. Marc Brackett explains that regulating emotions is not about suppressing them. It's about using strategies that help us respond in ways that move us closer to the life and relationships we actually want. That distinction matters because suppression and regulation are not the same thing. Suppression says, "Don't feel this." Regulation says, "I feel this, and now I get to decide what happens next." One rejects the emotion. The other acknowledges it without handing over complete control. Imagine carrying a glass filled almost to the top with water. If someone bumps into you, the water spills. Most of us spend our lives blaming the person who bumped into us, but perhaps the more interesting question is, why was the glass already so full? Sometimes today's frustration isn't only about today. Perhaps you've been sleeping poorly. Perhaps you've been caring for everyone else while quietly ignoring your own needs. Perhaps you've been saying yes when your heart wanted to say no. Eventually, even something small feels impossibly heavy. Not because you're weak, but because you've been carrying more than anyone can carry forever. That realization invites compassion instead of shame. Because instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What have I been carrying?" Those two questions lead to very different lives. Creating space also means remembering that not every thought deserves immediate belief. Our minds are remarkably creative, especially when we're overwhelmed. A delayed reply becomes rejection, a mistake becomes failure. One difficult conversation becomes proof that a relationship is falling apart. When emotions become intense, our stories often become louder than reality. That doesn't make us irrational, it makes us human. Which is why one of the kindest things we can do is slow the story down. Ask yourself, do I know this is true? Or am I filling in the missing pieces because uncertainty feels uncomfortable? Sometimes we discover that the story is accurate. Sometimes we discover we've been carrying fears that haven't actually happened. Either way, slowing down gives reality a chance to speak before fear finishes writing the ending. I've found that one of the simplest ways to create this space is through gentle questions rather than immediate answers. Not, "How do I stop feeling this?" but, "What do I need right now?" Perhaps the answer is rest. Perhaps it's an honest conversation. Perhaps it's fresh air, a quiet walk, or a glass of water after a long day. These responses may seem almost too ordinary. Yet emotional health is rarely built through dramatic moments. More often, it's built through hundreds of small moments in which we choose awareness instead of autopilot. One thoughtful pause, one calmer response, one conversation handled with a little more patience than the last. Those moments accumulate. Little by little, they begin changing not only our relationships with other people, but also the relationship we have with ourselves. Because every time you pause before reacting, you're sending yourself a quiet message. I don't have to be controlled by the first emotion that arrives. That doesn't mean you'll always get it right. You won't. Neither will I. Emotional intelligence isn't about perfection, it's about practice. Some days you'll remember to pause. Some days you'll react first and reflect later. Both days are part of learning. Progress is rarely measured by never making mistakes. It's measured by how gently we return to ourselves after we do. And perhaps that's the most comforting part of all. You don't have to become a different person overnight. You don't have to wake up tomorrow with perfect patience or endless wisdom. You only need to create one small space. Just enough space to notice. Just enough space to choose. Just enough space to respond with the person you're slowly becoming. Because once you realize that your emotions don't have to make every decision for you, something else becomes possible. You begin to see that emotional intelligence isn't a destination you someday arrive at. It's a skill you strengthen, one ordinary moment at a time. And that's where we'll bring everything together in the final part. If there is one thing I hope you remember after today, it is this: nothing about you is hopeless. For a long time, many of us have quietly carried the belief that some people are simply born better at life. Better at staying calm, better at handling conflict, better at letting things go. We look at someone who seems emotionally steady and think, I could never be like that. But what if emotional steadiness is not something people are simply given? What if it is something they learn? That is one of the most hopeful ideas in Dr. Marc Brackett's work. Emotional intelligence is not a personality trait reserved for a fortunate few. It is a set of skills that can be practiced and strengthened over time. That means your past does not have to become your permanent identity. The fact that you were never taught how to understand your emotions does not mean you are incapable of learning now. And perhaps that realization changes the entire conversation. Because this was never about becoming a person who feels less. It was never about becoming perfectly calm, perfectly patient, or perfectly in control. It was about learning how to stop being at war with yourself. Think about how much energy we spend fighting our own emotions. We criticize ourselves for being anxious. We shame ourselves for being sad. We tell ourselves we should be stronger, less sensitive, less affected by things that matter to us. But what if the goal is not to eliminate those feelings? What if the goal is to meet them with enough understanding that they no longer have to scream for our attention? When you begin recognizing your emotions, naming them, and creating a little space before reacting, something very quiet starts to happen. You become less afraid of yourself. You no longer need to panic every time a difficult feeling appears. You start trusting that a feeling is not an emergency. It is simply a signal that deserves attention. And that trust changes everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that are easy to miss while they are happening. One day you notice that you pause before replying to a hurtful message. Another day you realize you can admit you're disappointed instead of pretending you're fine. Then, almost without noticing when it happened, you discover that the voice in your head has become a little kinder. That is real growth, not the absence of difficult emotions, the presence of greater understanding. I think many people spend years trying to become someone new, when what they are actually longing for is permission to be human without feeling ashamed of it. Maybe that is true for you too. Maybe you have spent a long time believing you were too much, too sensitive, too reactive, too emotional. But perhaps the truth is much gentler than that. Perhaps you have simply been carrying feelings that no one ever taught you how to carry. And if that is true, I hope you stop calling yourself difficult. I hope you stop apologizing for having a heart that feels deeply. Because the goal was never to become someone who feels less. The goal was always to become someone who understands themselves more. So the next time a difficult feeling appears, you do not have to silence it immediately. You do not have to believe every story it tells, and you do not have to judge yourself for having it. Just pause for a moment. Take one slow breath and ask yourself, what might this feeling be trying to help me understand? You may not find the answer right away. That is okay. Understanding yourself has never been a race. It is a relationship, and relationships grow stronger through honesty, patience, and repeated moments of attention. Thank you for slowing down with me today. If this conversation helped you see yourself with a little more kindness, I hope you carry that kindness with you after the video ends. Because sometimes the most important journey we take is not the journey toward becoming someone different. It is the journey of finally learning how to come home to ourselves.